My talk is going to be, in contrast to some of the previous talks that you've heard today, it's going to be a little bit more speculative. So I've been asked to assess some of the pros and cons, the possible pros and cons of changing the system for Dáil dissolution in Ireland. So by its very nature, that is somewhat speculative. And I'm going to be giving you some of the possible pros and cons. So there's going to be quite a lot of, on one hand and on the other hand. But hopefully I'm going to be picking up on some of the points that were made in earlier presentations as well, at the risk of repetition. But on a complex topic, I guess there's no harm in having a bit of repetition just to hammer the point home. So much of what I'm going to say here refers to a trade-off here really between fairness on one hand and flexibility on the other hand. So the current system that we have, whereby the Taoiseach can effectively dissolve the Dáil under most circumstances at any time, is very flexible. And there are advantages to that flexibility, as I'll talk about in a minute. The downside, and critics would argue that the downside, is that it's not very fair. All of the power is concentrated in the hands of the Taoiseach, which gives the Taoiseach's party a political advantage. And so critics would say that the system isn't very fair and could be improved in terms of its fairness. So what is the nature of that advantage that the Taoiseach's party has as a result of this power that the Taoiseach has to dissolve the Dáil and call an early election? Well, there's a couple of dimensions to it. First of all, the Taoiseach can choose to call an election. Sorry, just before I go on with that, I should say I don't have slides here, but in the notes that I distributed beforehand, there is a table there on the second page, and it might be handy just to have that open in front of you, and I'll refer to some of the issues on that as we go along. So, sorry, resuming, what are the advantages that this power gives the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach's party? Well, the Taoiseach can call an election at a time when his or her party is popular and competing parties are unpopular. So that's one dimension of that advantage. Another dimension of the advantage is that the election can be a surprise, and so the Taoiseach's party can be ready for an election, can be prepared while other parties are ill-prepared for the election. So that's another dimension of the advantage. And as we've heard from Petra, there's also a bargaining dimension to the advantage as well when it comes to power within the government. So if you have a coalition government, any additional powers that are vested in the Taoiseach can potentially give the Taoiseach's party a bargaining advantage within the government, and that can also be seen to be an unfair advantage by critics of the current system. So any changes that might be considered to the current system effectively involve increasing the range, the number of people who will be involved in making the decision to call an election. So the current situation is that it's essentially just the Taoiseach, but that can be extended out to a greater number of people, and there are various different levels to which it could be extended out. And depending on how far you go, each increase in the number of people who are brought into this decision will increase the fairness of the system, arguably. So, for example, the most minimal change could be to move from a system whereby it's just in the hands of the Taoiseach to a system whereby it's in the hands of the Cabinet. And the big implication of that would be that it's not just the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach's party who get to choose the time, but it's also the other coalition partners as well who are involved in that decision. Historically, whereas Ireland used to have single-party governments very often, in which case that wouldn't have made any difference. Nowadays, coalition governments are the norm, yet the rules give power only to the Taoiseach with regards to election timing, and the other members of the government have no formal role in that decision. So moving to a situation whereby it was the Cabinet rather than the Taoiseach who was responsible would arguably make the system, would level the playing field a little bit in terms of what goes on within the government. I should say, however, that in practice, even though junior members of a government are not formally involved in the decision to call an election, the practice has been that the Taoiseach would consult with the other members of the government on that decision. But there are several countries where it is the cabinet who has that responsibility rather than the Prime Minister. And that tends to be countries that are used to having coalition governments like we in Ireland are now, but the situation currently doesn't reflect that, essentially. Okay, so at the next level of increasing the range of people who are involved in making this decision to call an early election, we could consider a situation whereby it is the Parliament as a whole, through a majority vote, that has the power to call an early election. So that, under most circumstances, would still mean that the government was in control of that decision, because under most normal circumstances, the government will command a majority in the Parliament. And again, there are examples of countries where it is the Parliament, by a majority vote, that has the decision to dissolve itself and to call an early election. And then at a maybe, and a maybe more extreme level would be that it would be a supermajority that would have the power to call an early election. In other words, perhaps 2/3 or a majority bigger than 50% would be a supermajority. And that would mean that it wouldn't just be the government who would be deciding on the timing of the election, but it would also require at least part of the opposition to be involved in that decision as well. So each of these increases that we might think about in terms of increasing the range of decision makers who are involved in this decision will arguably increase the fairness of the system, but potentially at a loss of flexibility. The more people who you need to get agreement to make that decision, the more difficult it becomes to make that decision, and so the system becomes a little bit more inflexible. And there are consequences to that, which I will come to. One point that I should make before I proceed is that the critics of the current system point to this fairness issue and the inequality in it, which might lead you to the conclusion that the Taoiseach's party is in a very advantageous position in terms of elections, and the Taoiseach's party typically does very well in elections, which tends not to be the case, actually, as Eoin O'Malley has already pointed out this morning. There does tend to be typically a cost of governing. Governing parties tend to actually lose votes. So the power of the Taoiseach to call an early election really is about mitigating that and minimising the losses that governments typically incur. The Taoiseach can choose an election at a time that is opportune for itself, and thereby minimising the losses that governments typically incur. So I say that just by way of not overemphasising the advantages that the Taoiseach's party enjoys under the current system. Okay. Another and related point to the ones that I've just been making is that if we look within the government, there potentially is an imbalance in terms of fairness. As I've mentioned, it is the Taoiseach's party and not the junior coalition parties who have the power to dissolve the government. Now, if we look at the cost of governing that I've just alluded to, typically it is the smaller junior parties in government that incur the biggest costs of governing. Those parties tend historically to do quite badly in subsequent elections. It's not always the case, but very often it is. I mean, we can think about the Labour Party in 2016. They had been a junior member of the previous government, and they did very badly in that election. In the previous election, the Green Party lost all of its seats, having been in government with Fianna Fáil. So very often small parties do very badly out of governing. And this isn't a good thing, because one of the implications of that is that small parties then, as a result, might be reluctant to go into government as a junior partner. And we saw that in 2016. The government negotiations took a very long time, primarily because most parties were reluctant to go into government as a junior member for fear of then being punished at the next election, as Labour had been. Anything that would increase the incentives for parties to go into government is arguably a good thing, because we don't want a situation whereby parties are running scared from government. It's an important part of our democratic system that parties seek to get into government, seek to implement their policies that their voters elected them on. And the situation that we saw after the last election wasn't ideal, because so many parties were standing back from government and reluctant to go into it. So, how does this relate to fixed-term parliaments? arguably giving the junior member of the government more say on things like election timing might make it a more attractive proposition for them to go into government. Now, I say might because the implications are probably fairly minor in terms of the calculus for a small party as to whether or not to go into government. But if they did have a formal role in the decision to call an election, that might influence their decision and might make government a slightly more attractive proposition. Okay, so what about the downsides to changing the current system and to increasing the range of decision makers necessary to call an early election? So I mentioned at the outset that a loss of flexibility is one of the main considerations there, one of the main downsides of that. And what we can think about here, and you can see it on the last point on that table on page 2, is the problem of lame duck governments. Again, I should emphasize that this is not a problem that I believe would be particularly serious or particularly likely to occur, but it's nonetheless something that needs to be considered. Now, what I mean by a lame duck government, if a government is ineffective because it has lost support, so for example, a government might have lost some members along the way through by-elections or through defections or for whatever reason, and so it is kind of hobbling along with a bare majority or is in a minority position and is unable to govern effectively as a result, there should be a possibility of getting out of that impasse. And currently, the way that a government can get out of that impasse usually is by calling an election, seeking a renewed mandate. If a greater range of people were needed to call it an election, for example, if it was a supermajority, so the government and opposition parties had to agree in order to call it an election, there could potentially be an incentive for an opposition party not to grant the government's desire for an election. If the government is in a weak position, is not governing effectively, perhaps there might be an incentive on the part of the opposition to let the government suffer, if you like, for a little bit longer in order that their popularity would continue to decline. However, again, as with other points that I've made, I want to stress that this isn't a highly likely scenario, because by doing so, an opposition would likely be punished by the voters themselves for engaging in that kind of strategic activity. So that is the issue of the lame duck government, which is a potential, but not a very serious potential problem with changing the current system. One of the other issues that has been raised by Petra already are the policy implications and this issue of the political business cycle. Now, what's a political business cycle? A political business cycle is a situation whereby a government tries to manipulate the economic cycle for its own benefit. So, governments want to be popular at election time. And so there's therefore an incentive on the part of a government to try and make sure that the economy is doing well at election time. So if the government starts interfering with the economic cycle to bring about an artificial boom around the time of the election, that can lead to economic instability. And economists will tell you that it's not a desirable situation whereby the government is artificially creating booms around election time. Now, so what has this got to do with fixed-term parliaments? Some people have argued that this kind of behaviour is more likely when terms are fixed or, if you like, less flexible. The reason being, under the current situation whereby terms are flexible, the government does not have to manipulate the economic cycle so that it peaks at around election time, because they can simply choose to hold an election when the economy is naturally doing well. If they don't have that option, and if they know the election is going to be in 4 years' time, then they don't have that option to follow the economic cycle when choosing the election, so they might have the incentive to try and manipulate the economic cycle to match the electoral calendar. However, again, I want to stress that I don't think that this risk, this danger of politicians engaging in this kind of activity is greatly influenced by the fixed-term parliaments argument. There are a number of other constraints which would prevent the government from engaging in that kind of activity. For example, the government in Ireland can't change the interest rates, which is one of the tools whereby they might otherwise manipulate the economic cycle. Interest rates are set by the European Central Bank, so the government has no control over that. Also, fiscal policy, so taxing and spending. The government is under a lot of constraints by its membership of the EU to run a balanced budget. So there's very limited scope for governments to get involved in that kind of political business cycle. So again, I think that the implications there are relatively modest. How am I doing for time there? Is it? Okay. So maybe just one final point on these pros and cons relates to the issue of government stability. Now, you might be forgiven for thinking that if you're moving to a more fixed term system, that will be associated with greater government stability. Now, as Petra has already outlined, that's not necessarily the case. So moving to a more fixed-term system will lead to more predictability with regards to when the election will happen, but it won't necessarily result in greater government stability, because you can have government change more often within the terms of a single parliament. Now, in Ireland, we're not particularly used to having a change of government without an election. It doesn't happen. It's happened very rarely in Irish political history. But if you were to fix the terms of the Parliament, and if the government had an internal disagreement and the relationship between the government partners broke down, you would more likely see changes of government without an election, which is something to be considered whether or not this is something that Irish voters would like to see or not. Okay, and then my final point, because I was asked to mention the role of the President as well, which has been discussed at length in previous presentations. But just one point to make about the role of the President. The reason why, or the logic behind the President having a role in the dissolution of the Dáil when the Taoiseach is deemed to have lost the majority support in the Dáil is because it is not a desirable situation if the Taoiseach is deemed to be calling an election against the will of the majority. So if the Taoiseach has lost the support of the majority of the Dáil and there is a potential alternative government in waiting that is ready to take the reins of office, then arguably it is wrong for the Taoiseach to be able to pull the rug out from that government from forming and to call an early election. So that's why the President has discretion, and if the Taoiseach is deemed to have lost the support of the majority of the Dáil, the President has the discretion to decide whether or not to permit a request for dissolution. And the role of the President there is to try and judge whether or not there is actually an alternative government in waiting that is ready to take the reins. Now, if you were to change the system so that it was, for example, a majority in Parliament or a supermajority in Parliament that was needed in order to call an early election, then arguably the need for presidential discretion in this matter is reduced. Because if it is the case that the Dáil voted for an early election, then we already know that the Dáil wants an early election. And so it's not the situation whereby the Taoiseach is acting against the will of a majority in Parliament. And so that if there was a change in that direction, then the role of the President would become less important, and arguably that clause in the Constitution would no longer be necessary. Okay, well, thank you very much.